Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and it's story time in America. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about geography, we're going to talk about politics, we're going to talk about apple pie, we're going to talk about tacos, we're going to talk about what exactly America is. We're going to follow that outline right up above my little yellow box. So you're encouraged to put that outline in your notes to serve as a framing device for the information that's about to follow. And that information is going to be about American history stories, because it's American history stories that will allow us to build answers to those questions up there. What is America? What is history? What is American history? And why bother? After all, why did these individuals bother writing all of these books about American history? Why do people bother reading them? Why are college students required to take, American history as a degree requirement? And to help us with that, we're going to turn to the founder of Ford Motor Company, the great industrialist and engineer, Henry Ford. And this is what Henry Ford said about history in 1916. History is more or less bunk. The only history worth a damn is the history we make today. Henry Ford did not have a very high opinion of history. And here's the thing about Henry Ford. Henry Ford is absolutely correct. And Henry Ford's opinion is actually an opinion shared by a lot of students. They don't understand what is the point of all of this stuff they are supposed to learn. It just seems to be this random collection of facts and figures that they got to learn about this and they got to learn about that and they got to learn about this war and this battle and that battle and a little bit about George Washington and a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. But it's all this sort of random disconnected stuff that doesn't seem to do anything. And this is why a lot of students really hate history, and a lot of students do. And this is absolutely why Henry Ford is correct. Henry Ford was an engineer. And to an engineer, things actually have to do something. A camshaft does something. A gearbox performs a function. A radiator serves a utility. And this is why Henry Ford is correct. Because for history to be worth a damn, it has to do something. You have to be able to do something with it. History, to be worthwhile, must serve a function. History must perform a utility. Now, one of the more obvious utilities of history is it can take contemporary problems and we can see how people handled similar problems in the past. And we live in the age of COVID-19. This terrible disease burst out of China and ravaged the world in 2020 and looks well set to ravage the world well into 2021. And, almost 200,000 Americans have died from this disease. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. It is historically changing the country. But America has encountered something similar to COVID-19 in the past. More than 100 years ago, the United States was ravaged by something very similar, the Spanish flu. The great Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1919. It has a lot of similarities with COVID-19. Both diseases kind of come out of China. Both diseases have a profound impact on the country. Both diseases changed world history. And we can see what people did to prevent the spread of this terrible disease back in 1918 to prevent the spread of Spanish flu. And incidentally, it's very unfair to Spain to call it the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is actually from China. And it's called the Spanish flu because Spain is one of the only countries that actually started ringing the alarm bell about how totally dangerous this disease was. Newspapers and media in America, in Britain, in Europe, all essentially lied about the Spanish flu. It was only the Spanish newspapers that started reporting the spread of this terrible disease. Hence, everybody started calling it the Spanish flu, but it's very unfair to Spain. But we can see what the reactions to the Spanish flu are to some extent very similar to COVID-19. You have people wearing masks. You can even see she's not wearing the mask correctly. Her nose is poking out over the top of it because nobody likes to wear masks. And local towns and cities passed ordinances: wear a mask, go to jail. And we can see the things they did back in 1918, and they're almost the exact same things that we did in 2020. Closed schools, closed theaters, prohibited public gatherings. And this was all an attempt to prevent the spread of the disease. And it was only partially successful. Mostly what they did in response to the Spanish flu is die, and they died in large numbers. There's more than 650,000 people in the United States died from the Spanish flu in a country that's a fraction of the size that it is today. And worldwide, more than 50 million people died from the Spanish flu, more than twice the number of dead in the First World War. And indeed, the Spanish flu changed world history. The height of the Spanish flu was October 1918. It is absolutely no coincidence that World War I ended in November of 1918. The end of hostilities in World War I was partially a response to this terrible disease that was sweeping across the world. And people did very similar things. Of course, our medical technology back in 1918 wasn't quite as good as it is today, but still, masks, closing theaters, closing schools, prohibiting public gatherings, our responses are almost the same. And the Spanish flu lasted a year and a half. And if that's similar, then COVID-19 should last almost a year and a half. And I have to include this picture just for giggles. Here's a family doing their civic duty, preventing the spread of the Spanish flu back in 1918. And they're all wearing masks, and they even made a mask for the kitty. Even the kitty's got a mask on. Cats couldn't catch the Spanish flu, so it's just being cute. So at any rate, history must serve a function. It must perform a utility. And one of the things about American history is most people actually already have an idea of American history in their head. They have these American history stories, these popular narratives lodged in their collective memory. And most of the history that people actually know doesn't consist of sort of these deep analyses of historical records. But the way that people approach history, the way that people know American history, is through stories. People know the history of America primarily through the stories they tell, through the stories they listen to, and through the media they consume. And here we have American history stories. We've got George Washington and the Cherry Tree, Johnny Appleseed, Big John Henry, and of course, Pocahontas. And I am now going to tell you a story about American history. Start with George Washington. George Washington and the Cherry Tree. Young George Washington was on his father's farm, and he was gifted a brand new hatchet. And little George Washington, I mean, you can see in the picture, even though he's a little boy, he's still got the old man George Washington face. George Washington runs around his father's farm with his brand new sharp hatchet. He runs by the farmhouse and he gives it a whack. He runs by a fence post and he gives it a whack. He runs by his father's favorite cherry tree and he gives it a whack, and his brand new hatchet goes straight through. The tree falls over. Young George Washington is completely horrified. He runs and hides. Papa Washington comes out and sees his favorite cherry tree has been cut down. So he brings together the family. He brings together all the farmhands, everybody who's helping on the farm. And he goes, "Who cut down my cherry tree? Who could have done this?" And one of the farmhands kind of like raises his hand. And Papa Washington goes, "Yes, you saw who did it?" And the farmhand goes, "Yeah, I saw your boy do it. Young George Washington, you know, the kid with the creepy old man face. He cut down your cherry tree." And Papa Washington goes, "No way, that is absolutely impossible. There is no way that little George Washington, the light of my life, the apple of my eye, there's no way that my boy could have chopped down a cherry tree." "Is that right, George?" But young George Washington knows he cannot tell a lie. So little George Washington steps out and he takes out his brand new hatchet and he says, "Oh, Father, oh, Papa Washington, I cannot tell a lie. 'Twas I who cut down your cherry tree." And Papa Washington is completely surprised by this. He says, "You know that was my favorite cherry tree. But truly, son, you have given me a gift worth more than 1,000 pieces of gold. For you have told me that you are a virtuous boy who is willing to do the hard thing instead of to tell a lie." And then he takes George Washington's new hatchet away and then whips him. George Washington and the Cherry Tree. Johnny Appleseed. The stories about Johnny Appleseed are about him crisscrossing the country, planting apples, wearing pots on his head, making friends of woodland creatures, including a three-legged wolf. Big John Henry, was a steel-driving man, raced the steam pile, pounding spikes into the railroad. Pocahontas and John Smith had an animated adventure in 17th century Virginia where they sang songs and fell in love. Here's the thing about these stories. Here's the thing about these sort of popular narratives that exist in the collective memory of America. These are all real people, okay? George Washington was a real person. Johnny Appleseed was a real person. Big John Henry was a real guy. Both Pocahontas and John Smith actually existed. These are all real people from American history. The stories are nonsense. The stories are completely made up. Largely made up. Johnny Appleseed's story is fairly accurate. Big John Henry may not have raced a steam engine. John Smith and Pocahontas did not fall in love. There's no romantic relationship between them. John Smith was like 40 when Pocahontas was like 11. And the story about George Washington and the cherry tree was, of course, completely invented. It was invented by this sort of hagiographer of George Washington, a guy called Parson Weeks. And it's very obviously completely made up. But these stories exist in the popular imagination. So a collective memory, some concept of American history already exists in the brains of all Americans. They know these stories. A collective memory clearly exists. Now we're going to define what a collective memory is. It's important because it's in all caps. A collective memory is the collection of myths, stories, half-remembered histories, tall tales, memories, and knowledge informally shared between all the people in a group and imperfectly passed from one generation to the next. Such collective memories change over time from one generation to the next, with the veracity of people, places, and events shifting in time. Some stories are very, very popular. In the 19th century, one of the most favorite plays was a story about Metacom, the story of King Philip. And now almost nobody knows anything about it. In fact, King Philip's War is almost completely forgotten. One of the most important military conflicts in American history. Almost completely forgotten. And we can actually demonstrate how this collective consciousness, how this collective memory changes over time. And if you look at this chart on my left, this was from a psychological study that was published in 2015 in Trends in Cognitive Science. And what they did is they gave people a list of presidents, and they had people say one or two things about each president. And what they did is they were tracking who remembers what about the American presidents, all the way from George Washington on there on the left to Barack Obama over on the right. And what they found was really, really interesting. And they found that knowledge about these presidents changes when you talk about what different generations people belong to. If you look at the kind of orange line, those are people born before 1974. So the orange line, those are the baby boomers. Those are the people born right after World War II. And the blue line, those are people born, the yellow line, those are people born basically before 1991. Those are the Generation Xers. Those are my people. And here are most millennials and most Gen Ys is the blue line. These are people born before 2009. And what you can see is that there are some correlations. There's something that everybody knows. But as you get into the more recent period, memories change considerably. Everybody knows George Washington, and everybody knows John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, the big guys in the beginning. Everybody kind of knows those. And then there's that big spike right in the middle of American history. That is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. Virtually everybody knows everything about Abraham Lincoln, and a little bit about Andrew Johnson and a little bit about U.S. Grant. But the real divergence comes when you get into the 20th century presidents. According to this chart, the baby boomers, they know about Calvin Coolidge. They know about Herbert Hoover. They know about, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They knew about these guys. But the Gen Xers, the people born in the 70s and 80s, they're kind of wishy-washy on those early guys. And their sort of collective memory doesn't really kind of perk up until you get after World War II. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, Ford. Those guys kind of get a pickup there. And the people born before 2009, the blue line, they really don't start remembering presidents until you get into the 1980s. Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush. And generally, one of the things they remember about these presidents is only generally a single line. Take poor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You know, saved the country from the Great Depression, fought World War II, defeated Nazi Germany. 9 times out of 10 in my history classes, this is what students know FDR. He's the wheelchair guy. That's all they know about him. John F. Kennedy, Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, civil rights. What's the one thing people remember about John F. Kennedy? Shot in Dallas, all right? Many of these presidents are reduced, their entire administrations are reduced to a single line. And I have to keep this PG-13, so I can't even talk about Bill Clinton, his presidency, the single sentence that represents his presidency. And as you can see from the chart, most presidents, they don't even get a single sentence. Man, poor Taft, right down the memory hole, the fattest president we ever had. James Polk, you know, probably the most important president between Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln. Completely forgotten about. Poor James Polk, almost completely gone. Teddy Roosevelt, oh, national parks, you know, Rough Riders, Spanish-American War, no. James Garfield, almost completely forgotten. That dude was assassinated. He's the second president assassinated in American history. Right down the memory hole. A lot of these people drop away from the collective memory. And people just don't know them. You know, poor Calvin Coolidge, actually probably one of the best presidents we've ever had. Calvin Coolidge had a pet raccoon in the White House. Silent Cal. Down the memory hole. These collective memories change over time. And one of the utilities of American history, it's important, so put this in your notes. One of the important utilities of American history is that the formal study of American history, and in fact, the formal study of the past, it improves our collective memory. It tests the veracity of these semi-mythical, legendary narratives. It doesn't mean we have to criticize Pocahontas. It's a wonderful movie. There's, you know, the animation's good. We can look at the songs. We don't have to be the guy who says, oh, everything about this is wrong. But we should know that it is not what actually happened. There was no romantic relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas. They didn't burst into song. And John Smith was not tall, good-looking, and blonde hair. He was short, ugly, and had lots of hair and a big bushy beard. He's only like 5'3" or 5'4". He's a really short guy. Let's actually test what about American history you know. If you see those 5 flags right up at the top, we have 5 flags. 3 of those flags were actually American flags. 2 of them were not. And the real American flags are A, B, and C. A, that is the 48 star flag. That's the flag that the veterans took to World War II with them. It is before Alaska and Hawaii were states. So there's only 48 states. So only 48 stars on that map. B is the Bennington flag, which was flown in parts of New England during the American Revolution. C is, I think, a very attractive looking flag. That's the late 19th century flag, the flag from basically the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. They arranged the stars in a circle, and I think there's only like 35, 36 stars on that flag. And of course, D and E aren't even flags of the United States at all. D is the old Mississippi state flag that they're in the process of changing right now. And E isn't even a real flag. That's the flag that's the flag of the United States that's used in the video game Fallout. That never actually existed, but it looks like a real flag because you see they based it off the old 19th century flag. So these are the flags of America, and we're going to address exactly what is America, because people mean different things when they refer to the term, when they use the term. And in fact, we're going to talk about 3 distinct definitions for America: geographic, political, and cultural, because people mean different things when they say these things. So we're going to start with a geographic definition of America. This is absolutely the easiest definition. So here we have a map. Is this America? And the answer is yes. This is geographic America. And I'm going to give you a geographic definition of America. America is 2 continents: North America in the north, South America in the south, with a 3rd region, Central America, in the middle. And there's an important linguistic component to this as well. It is a mostly English-speaking North and a mostly Spanish-speaking South. Not everyone speaks English in North America. Not everyone speaks Spanish in South America. You go to Montreal, you're not going to hear a lot of English. You go to the Navajo Indian Reservation in Arizona, you're probably not going to hear a lot of English. You go to Brazil thinking you're going to use your Spanish, you are going to be sadly mistaken because they speak Portuguese there. You go to Belize thinking you're going to speak a lot of Spanish, and you're going to hear a lot of English. In fact, I remember going to Guatemala and trying in my own terrible Spanish to communicate with a bunch of people who ended up being Quechua Maya Indians. And I thought my Spanish was beyond incomprehensible. And then one of my Guatemalan friends pointed out, why are you trying to speak Spanish to these guys? They don't speak very good Spanish. They don't speak Spanish at all. They speak Quechua Maya. So mostly is very important. A mostly English-speaking North and a mostly Spanish-speaking South. So here is our geographic definition of America. Geographic America consists of, I got my book. Geographic America consists of two continents, North America and South America, with a third region, Central America, in the middle. The North is mostly English-speaking and the South is mostly Spanish-speaking. The political definition of America is slightly more complex, but it isn't that much more complex. Is this America? The answer is, of course, yes. This is America, but it's a different kind of America. It is not a geographic America. This is the United States of America, a political entity. This is our political definition of America. And when people use the term America, they generally refer to the political union. And the political union is the United States of America. And it is, of course, bound together by a single political document, the United States Constitution. And what exactly is bound together by the U.S. Constitution? Well, the states. We have 50 states, of course, but that's not all of the United States. We not only have 50 states, we also have more than 500 federally recognized Indian nations. And these more than 500 federally recognized tribes, some of them they're sort of scattered around more than 326 Indian reservations, which are outlined in pink on this map. I mean, you can see them. Now, Indian nations possess a kind of unusual legal category. They possess a legal concept called Indian sovereignty. So while a reservation can be in a state, it may or may not have to follow any distinct state laws. In fact, the federal government has to mediate between, say, the state of Arizona and the Navajo Indian Reservation. And this is the concept of Indian sovereignty. So the political definition of the United States, it's bound together by the U.S. Constitution, but it's not just 50 states. It's also more than 500 Indian nations, sovereign Indian nations. But this isn't all that's bound together by the U.S. Constitution. The United States also possesses a number of territories and overseas dependencies. Now, territories and dependencies are this kind of thing that they may or may not permanently join the United States at any given time. We have a long history of territories that have become states. We also have a history of territories that opted for independence. The entire modern nation of the Philippines used to be a territory of the United States, but they were given the option. Do you want to become a state, stay a territory, or have your own country? And the Philippines opted for independence. There used to be another huge territory that covered large parts of the Pacific called the Trust Territory of the Pacific. And the Trust Territory of the Pacific ceased to exist, and most of those islands opted to become their own countries. But some of those islands opted to stay as territories. These are places like the Marianas Islands, Guam, Samoa, and some of these, the most famous U.S. territory is, of course, Puerto Rico, which has been an American territory for more than 100 years. And whenever Puerto Rico has had to decide whether it wants to stay a territory, become independent, or become a state, over the century, they have more or less always decided to stay a territory. There is a certain benefit to being a territory. You don't have to pay federal taxes, but you also don't get to vote in federal elections. Even though Puerto Rico, by any objective standard, should actually be a state. It's larger than the smallest states, and it's got a ton of people. And I think I think that Puerto Rico will become a state, in the next 10 to 20 years. In the most recent vote, Puerto Rico did actually vote to begin the process of becoming an American state. But as the Civil War proved, once you become a state, United States are indivisible. You can't leave. So, what is the political definition for the United States? The political definition for the United States, see, in my book. The political America is a political union based on the U.S. Constitution and consists of 50 states, more than 500 sovereign Indian nations, and a large number of territories and dependencies. That's the political definition of the United States. And this actually causes a lot of confusion, and it's a very humorous confusion. Like someone from Argentina or Brazil will fly to the United States and they'll say, "Oh, where are you from?" "Oh, I'm from Brazil." "Welcome to America." And the Brazilian thinks, I just went from one part of America to another part of America, because he's using the geographic definition, whereas the person in the US is using the political definition. Both of them are actually correct. So that's the geographic definition. That's the political definition. The third one is a very difficult definition, and we're going to try to work through it. It is the cultural definition for the United States, because culturally, the United States isn't a single culture at all. Like, here's a map of the United States. Is this America? The answer is yes. But what is this map? This is an ethnic map of the United States, because you see, the United States is characterized by regional ethnicities. The large amount of blue are people that are descended from German immigrants. The sort of tan color are people who self-identify as American. But generally, those are Scots, Irish, Appalachian types, the rednecks, with a whole lot of Native American mixed into them. The sort of purple section there, those are African Americans. The sort of mauve and pink up in New England, that's a mixture of French and English and Irish. The green up there in Minnesota, Scandinavian. That's why the football team is the Minnesota Vikings. The sort of salmon color across the South, those are Hispanics. The orange are Native Americans. See, you have all of these different ethnicities. There is not a single American ethnicity. This is why culturally, the United States is quite different from, say, England or France or Japan. England, France, Japan, Korea, these are countries that have one ethnicity, one language, a single culture. The United States is not like that. We have a large number of distinct regional ethnicities. And in fact, history can explain why the country actually looks like this, why we have these Scotch-descended Appalachian people scattered across the mountains, all the way from East Texas to Pennsylvania. History can explain why we have this huge clump of Scandinavians in Minnesota. It can explain why New England is made up of some sort of mixture of English, French, and Irish. This is the second important function of history. History helps explain why the country looks the way it does. Because all of these regional ethnicities can be tied back to distinct historical events. Immigration to the United States has never been a sort of steady trickle over time, but rather immigration to the United States has come as a series of waves over time. Something really bad will happen overseas and people will start to leave. They'll vote with their feet. And more often than not, they come to the United States. And you can see this chart, those waves of immigration from different parts of the world. We had the first wave of immigration in the 1700s, and the collapse of that wave of immigration had a profound impact on American history. In the early 19th century, we have a huge wave of immigration from Ireland as more than a third of the Irish nation flees the Great Potato Famine of Ireland. We have, a civil war in the nations of Germany in the 1848, which leads to a large number of German immigrants coming over in the middle and late 19th century. And then there's that huge crash where America slams the door shut for immigration in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And then it starts to creep up again. But this sort of huge second wave of immigration isn't coming from Europe. It's coming from Asia and Latin America. and all of, because of the events that take place there. And all of these different waves of immigration have created these distinct regional ethnicities, because the United States is not a single ethnicity. Culturally, we are a multi-ethnic republic. We are multi-ethnic. There we go. Grandma, apple pie, and baseball. Is this America? Yes. Okay. This is cultural America. What could be more American than grandma, apple pie, baseball? This is the heart of American culture. You can't get more American than mom, apple pie, and baseball. Or can you? Is this America? Tex-Mex tacos and Lone Star beer. Is this America? The answer is yes. This is a different regional culture. This is America in Texas. If you go to Minnesota or Wisconsin, they're not going to know what Lone Star is. You're not going to be able to find a good street taco in Minneapolis. They're going to do other things. They're going to have a different regional culture. In Wisconsin, they put cheddar cheese on apple pie. That's disgusting. I don't even know what that is. Because different regions of America have different cultures. They interpret the culture of America differently. Not only is America multi-ethnic, but we are multicultural. And in fact, I wanted a picture of a Texas grandma to go with the tacos and Lone Star beer. So I Googled Texas grandma, and this is the image that popped up at the top of the Google image search. So yeah, Texas grandma. Mima is strapped. Mima is strapped. Don't break into her house. Because culturally, there is not a single America. Culturally, there are many Americas. And this is why the United States is really very different from England or France or Korea or Japan. They have got one language. They have one ethnicity. They have one culture. We don't have that in the United States. We have multi-ethnic, we have multicultural regions. And indeed, this has been pointed out by a number of prominent scholars and historians like Joël Garreau and Colin Woodard. And then one of the things they've pointed out is you have these very distinct regions, and Colin Woodard even calls them the 11 American nations that are sort of scattered across the country. And he characterizes them as the Deep South, Appalachia, the Far West, the Left Coast, Yankeedom. And one of the things about America is if you are very uncomfortable where you live and you sort of don't like living in this part of the world, you can always pick up, move 500 miles and have a completely different culture. If you grew up thinking that, beer and tacos is absolutely disgusting, but cheddar cheese melted on top of apple pie sounds wonderful, you can go to Wisconsin. If you're a sane individual and you think that cheddar cheese on apple pie is absolutely disgusting and tacos and beer sound absolutely fantastic, then you can abandon the cultural wasteland known as Wisconsin and move to the utopia of Texas. There are many Americas. There's not a single America. In fact, Colin Woodard's book is really interesting. I reread it recently. And he does something really interesting. He attempts to plot American history as characterized by rival regional nations. It's a very interesting take on American history. And I can prove this. If you don't believe me, I can absolutely prove it. And I can prove it with malted, sugary, carbonated beverages. What is that a glass of there on the left? Is it a glass of pop, soda, or Coke? Because it depends what part of the United States you're in, what you actually call that thing. And if you look at the map right up above, this is a very famous soda map or pop map or Coke map. And if you grew up in the yellow part of America, then you call that thing pop. If you grew up in sort of the purpley part of that map, you call it a Coke. And if you grew up in kind of the light blue part of the map, you call that a soda. And this is an indication of what culture you grew up in inside the United States, whether you call it a pop, a Coke, or a soda. And some people call it different things. And in fact, I had a colleague He was, and he's from Minnesota. And he bumped into me in the hall, and he's like, Keith, where can I get a pop around here? And it actually took me like 2 minutes to figure out exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about soda. Oh, he wants a Coke. All right. Because I grew up in Louisiana. And this is not anything new. In fact, this was established very, very early on in American history. And in fact, it was noticed very early on in American history that the historic growth of the United States, the incorporation of older peoples, specifically mostly Native Americans, these surges of immigration throughout history, and it's America's own internal population movements have created this kind of hodgepodge of small, regionally distinctive cultures, small, culturally distinctive groups. And this was pointed out by, of all people, Alexis de Tocqueville himself. And Alexis de Tocqueville was a French historian and philosopher who visited the United States in the early 19th century. And he pointed this out, that you go from one part of the country to another part of the country. And even though you're inside the same country, virtually everything has changed. And this is what Alexis de Tocqueville called very distinctly American. He said that America is made up of, quote unquote, small, peculiar societies. In other words, America is a land of 10,000 tribes, ethnically, regionally quite distinct. One of these tribes has a Coke with their tacos. The other tribe has a pop with their cheese on top of apple pie. And in this way, America doesn't really resemble the countries of Europe. And this is why Europeans have a lot of problems understanding America. America really resembles the big multi-ethnic nations of Asia more than it does anything in Europe. America resembles India, Indonesia, China to some extent, these huge political unions of 10,000 tribes where they speak all these different languages and have all these different distinct cultures. In this way, the composition of the United States more resembles India than it does England. America is this multi-ethnic, multicultural, geographic, cultural, and political entity. And one of the more unusual things about America, and one of the more unusual things about American history, is that the center of power in America changes. America has a fluid center. It has a fluid center of cultural, economic, and political power, which changes over time. And this is, again, something very, very distinct from Europe. If you look at Britain, the political, economic, and cultural center of Britain is London, and it's been London for bloody 1,000 years. If you look at Italy, the cultural, economic, and political center of Italy is Rome, and it's been Rome all the way back since the days of the Roman Empire for like 2,500 years. America's not like that. It's not like France, which has Paris, or Germany, which has Berlin. The United States has a fluid center of power. The original center of the United States was Virginia. It was the largest, richest, and most prosperous colony. And after independence, it became the largest, wealthiest, and richest state. And this is why in the early American history, almost all of the presidents came from Virginia. And if you look at this map right up above my head, this is basically a map of the United States that shows which states the presidents have come from. And as you can see, a ton of presidents come from Virginia. And this makes no sense in the 21st century. I mean, Virginia is a nice state. I mean, it's extremely pretty. But it's just not that politically or economically or culturally important. But it was back in the early 19th century, back in the late 18th century. But Virginia's power and influence declined, and it really declined after the Civil War. And the power of Virginia was replaced with New York. New York became the cultural, political, and economic center of the United States for large portions of the 19th century. And then eventually New York had to sort of share this with the Midwest. And then that's why you've got this enormous number of presidents that come from Ohio and New England. And as we moved into the 20th century, we can see that slowly, the Pacific coast starts to take over. And especially after World War II, California becomes the political, economic, and cultural center of America. And California starts cranking out presidents. And because the presidents come from the center of power. And this is one of the aspects of American history that like Europeans have really struggled to explain this, because the center of America changes over time. And in fact, it's changing right now. We're in the middle of one of these big historical shifts in political, cultural, and economic power. And if you look at this map on the left, this is a map of the internal migration of the United States. Areas in gray are losing population. And the bigger the circle, the larger the population loss. Areas in blue are gaining population. And the bigger the circle, the larger the population gain. And you can largely see the old powers of New York, New England, and the Midwest are losing people. They're losing a lot of people. New York is getting slightly smaller every year, as is Chicago. And that big gray dot right in the middle of Michigan, that's Detroit. People are fleeing there like crazy. And California, the old political, cultural, and economic center of America in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. But not for much longer. People are fleeing California like crazy. And where are they going to? Where's the new center of power going to be? Texas, Colorado, Florida, North Carolina. The new sort of political, economic, and cultural center of the United States is moving once again from California to sort of the new South, the sort of new Dixie that's arisen since the old days of segregation. And you can see this in the internal population movement. And of course, COVID-19 is changing the historical trajectory of the United States. And the COVID pandemic has accelerated many of these trends. And, you know, a ton of people are just abandoning New York City like crazy. Frustrated Californians are fleeing the state. Indeed, next year, for the first time in its recorded history, the population of California is set to drop. They're expected to lose a seat in the House of Representatives. And if you look up right up above my head, you can see where this internal population is going. States that are losing representatives and losing power. And this power is moving to Texas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon. The country is absolutely changing. So what is our cultural definition of the United States? Culturally, America is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country with a mobile and slowly shifting political, economic, and cultural center. Culturally, America is a land of small, peculiar societies. That's what Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about America in the early 19th century, and it's still true of America in the 21st century. And one of the utilities of history is one of the uses of history is that history shows us why this is. It explains how all these different American nations came to be. History can show why things are the way they are. History can show us how this land of small, peculiar societies formed. And one of the things keeping these 10,000 tribes together, keeping all of these small, peculiar societies, keeping these 11 nations of America together is a common sense of identity, a common knowledge of America's history, a common sense of pride and accomplishment, and a shared mythic past, a collective memory about American history stories. In other words, America is bound together by a common sense of nationhood, by a common sense of nationalism, by a common sense of patriotism. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. And I will see you there.